Tonight, you're going to plug in your phone. You won't think about it. You'll just plug it in, watch the little battery icon turn green, and go about your evening. But that battery in your hand just connected you to one of the most controlled, contested, and quietly brutal supply chains on Earth. And almost nobody holding that phone has any idea. Here's the strange part. The metal inside your phone's battery, the one that lets it hold a charge for hours instead of minutes, comes from one place more than anywhere else on the planet. Not a country you'd guess, not Saudi Arabia, not Australia, not the United States. It comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. One country, roughly 70% of the entire world's cobalt supply. Not 70% of some niche industrial metal nobody uses. 70% of the mineral sitting inside your phone, your laptop, and very likely the car in your driveway right now. Stop and think about that for a second. 7 out of every 10 phones on Earth owe their battery life to a handful of mining regions in one of the poorest countries in the world. How did that happen? The answer starts with geology, not policy. Cobalt isn't usually mined on its own. It's a byproduct, something that comes up almost by accident while companies are digging for copper. In the southern region of the DRC, an area called the Copper Belt happens to sit on some of the richest copper-cobalt deposits anywhere on the planet. Nature put it there. Nobody planned it. But what happened next was entirely human. As the world shifted towards smartphones, laptops, and electric vehicles, demand for lithium-ion batteries exploded. And cobalt was one of the key ingredients that made those batteries stable and long-lasting. Suddenly, a byproduct metal that barely made headlines became one of the most strategically important materials on the planet. So who actually controls it? Here's where the story gets uncomfortable. According to the World Bank and U.S. Geological Survey data, large industrial mining companies dominate the formal supply. But underneath that formal system sits something else entirely: artisanal mining. Hundreds of thousands of people digging by hand, with shovels, with rebar, with nothing but their own bodies, scraping cobalt ore out of pits and tunnels. Harvard researcher Siddharth Kara spent years investigating this firsthand. He described mines where children as young as 5 or 6 work alongside their parents. Not in some isolated, tragic exception, but as a structural part of how a meaningful share of the world's cobalt gets out of the ground. Tunnels collapse, people die, and the cobalt keeps moving, because the demand on the other end of the supply chain never stops. Why hasn't this been fixed already? Because fixing it isn't simple. The formal mines and the informal ones aren't cleanly separated. Ore gets gathered by hand, sold to middlemen, and mixed into the same supply chains that eventually reach the same companies making your phone and your car battery. Tracing exactly where any given chunk of cobalt came from is extraordinarily difficult once it enters that pipeline. And here's the twist almost nobody expects. The DRC may dig up most of the world's cobalt, but it barely processes any of it. The actual refining, turning raw cobalt ore into the pure material battery manufacturers can use, happens almost entirely somewhere else. China controls roughly 2/3 of global refined cobalt production. Companies with Chinese backing also own major stakes in some of the largest mines inside the DRC itself. So the real picture isn't just one poor country holding the world's batteries hostage. It's a much stranger arrangement. The raw material comes out of some of the most dangerous, least regulated mining conditions on Earth. Then it travels almost entirely through a refining bottleneck controlled by a single country. 2 very different kinds of power, stacked on top of each other, and almost invisible to the person actually using the battery at the end of it. Western governments have started to notice. The United States, the European Union, and others have been racing to diversify cobalt supply chains, fund alternative mining projects, and pressure companies into more transparent sourcing. Apple has publicly committed to eventually using recycled cobalt in all of its products. But recycling takes years to scale, and right now it barely scratches the surface of total demand. Meanwhile, battery engineers are quietly trying to solve the problem from the other direction. Some companies are developing battery chemistries that use little or no cobalt at all. If that shift fully takes hold, the DRC's 70% stranglehold on this single metal could matter far less within a decade or two. But for now, every time global demand for phones, laptops, or electric vehicles ticks upward, so does the pressure on a handful of mining regions thousands of miles from the people buying the products. The price you pay at checkout has almost nothing to do with the price actually being paid in the ground. So the next time you plug in your phone and watch that battery icon turn green, you're not just charging a device. You're plugging into a supply chain that stretches from a smartphone store near you, through middlemen and refineries on the other side of the world, all the way down to a handful of mining pits in the Congo, where the actual story almost nobody talks about is still being written, one shovel at a time.